Hello and welcome to the International Positive Psychology Association Positive Psychology Leaders Series. Hello everyone, we're so glad you've joined us today, wherever you are in the world. Some of you have stayed up late for today's presentation. Some of you are up real early and some of you are at midday at work. Wherever you are, we appreciate you joining us. The Positive Psychology Leaders Series is something we're very proud of, something that started when we formed the International Positive Psychology Association, and that is to bring researchers up front and close to you so that you get the latest and greatest and cutting-edge research updates. And so today is no exception. We have an incredible presenter, someone I know very well. She's a favorite inside the field of positive psychology, but she is now everywhere around the world with her subject of her research, grit, and her name is Angela Duckworth, Dr. Angela Duckworth. I'm David J. Paulé, your host and co-founder of the Positive Psychology Leader Series. I'm an author and executive coach, so it's an honor for me to be here with Dr. Duckworth today. She joins an esteemed group of presenters who have been with us over the last 9 years. We celebrate our 10th year next year, so we have some exciting presentations on the rise and coming. But you'll also find in the archive the presentations of everyone who's ever presented. So Marty Seligman is in there, and Ed Diener, and Sonia Lubomirski, and our president, Barb Fredrickson. And the slide that I just started to advance to is that the recording of this webinar with Angela Duckworth will be posted next week to our site, so it will be available for you to listen at your leisure. So if you don't take notes quickly, like I'm very slow at taking notes, listening to the archive afterwards is really quite great. Two important things to share with you. This is a question and answer session pretty much in its entirety. So we want to hear from you. At any time you have a question, just type it into the control panel on your webinar control panel screen and try to make your question as succinct or as brief as you can, and let us know where you're writing in from and who you are. We love to know, and we appreciate that very much. One other thing I have to just say, my producer for the International Positive Psychology Association Positive Psychology Leader Series, that's a mouthful, her name is Jenny Brennan, and guess what? It was her birthday this week. In fact, it was yesterday. So I have to wish her a happy birthday and thank her for everything that she does to make this program successful. So without further delay, let me introduce our special guest. She's as strong a researcher as she is and a wonderful professor. She's also a tremendous person. Let me go ahead and share with you a brief introduction. Dr. Angela Duckworth is a 2013 MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She has advised the White House in the United States, the World Bank, the NBA and NFL teams, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Prior to her career in research, she was an award-winning math and science teacher. She completed her BA in neurobiology at Harvard, her MSc in neuroscience at Oxford, and her PhD in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. It's hard to believe with the reviews as being as positive about this book, particularly the cutting-edge science, but also the way it's written, that this is actually Dr. Duckworth's first book. So without further delay, please let me introduce and welcome Dr. Angela Duckworth. Hello, Angela.
Hi.
Nice to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's awesome. I have to say right from the beginning, congratulations. The book is a bestseller. Everyone who's read it has just said it's a great read, but it's just packed. It's dense, full of application research and pretty much everything you're interested in if you're someone following the grit subject. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I have to say the other thing that's just fun at the beginning is to say that you are everywhere. I was just the other morning, it's 6 in the morning, listening to a local sportscaster interviewing a local university basketball coach, and he starts quoting Angela, and he uses your middle name, Angela Lee Duckworth, and spends about 20 minutes reviewing the power of grit and how that you went out to meet with the Seattle Seahawks, and he was so excited. So I had to tell you that. I also received a call from my mother the other day. Said, you have to get on television. Charlie Rose is interviewing Angela Duckworth. So you really truly are everywhere.
Thank you. For better or for worse, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic book, and I thought we'd just begin with just personal connection. You write after you won the MacArthur Genius Grant, which is unbelievably impressive. So few people get that award, and you can't apply for it, you just receive it. And in the introduction or the preface to the book, tell a really powerful story about your father and your work. And I thought if you could just start off by reading that story, beginning with the morning the MacArthur was announced.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'll start with 2 years ago. Does that sentence sound right to you?
Yeah, sure.
2 years ago, I was fortunate enough. Okay.
Yes.
2 years ago, 2 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, sometimes called the Genius Grant. You don't apply for the MacArthur. You don't ask your friends or colleagues to nominate you. Instead, a secret committee that includes the top people in your field decides you're doing important and creative work. When I received the unexpected call telling me the news, my first reaction was one of gratitude and amazement. Then, my thoughts turned to my dad and his offhand diagnoses of my intellectual potential. This is a reference to how he would talk to me when I was a little girl and say that I was no genius. He wasn't wrong. I didn't win the MacArthur because I'm leagues smarter than my fellow psychologists. Instead, he had the right answer, no, she's not, to the wrong question, is she a genius? I don't know if you want me to go on from there or pause.
Yeah, just go on from there, just to finish that part.
There was about a month between the MacArthur call and its official announcement. Apart from my husband, I wasn't permitted to tell anyone. That gave me time to ponder the irony of the situation. A girl who is told repeatedly that she's no genius ends up winning an award for being one. The award goes to her because she has discovered that what we eventually accomplish may depend more on our passion and perseverance than our innate talent. She has by then amassed degrees from some pretty tough schools, but in the 3rd grade, she didn't test high enough for the gifted and talented program. Her parents are Chinese immigrants, but she didn't get lectured on the salvation of hard work. Against stereotype, she can't play a note of piano or violin. The morning the MacArthur was announced, I walked over to my parents' apartment. My mom and dad had already heard the news, and so had several aunties, who were calling in rapid succession to offer congratulations. Finally, when the phone stopped ringing, my dad turned to me and said, "I'm proud of you." I had so much to say in response, but instead I just said, "Thanks, Dad." There was no sense rehashing the past. I knew, in fact, that he was proud of me. So maybe I'll pause there again. No, you don't want me to redo the whole book, that's for sure.
Well, actually, there are some of us who particularly love audiobooks, but the power of that story is just something that I want to draw people to the beginning of the book, where your father surely is proud of you, and you tell a really heartwarming story about his really communicating that to you. But the fact that you are super smart, there's no doubt about it, but that you discovered in your research that it's more than just talent, it's more than just smarts, that really you have found have led to people being very successful. And that is just, it's interesting for research, or interesting for us who see people who are doing such great research, just to see the personal connection to some of your research. And so thank you for reading that story, Angela.
Thank you. It's the truth, and I did actually, read the book to my dad, so I had to read him that exact passage. And I have a growth mindset about my own parents. I will tell you that the father I had as a little girl is not the same father that I had as a young woman, and he's of course not the same person today. So he's he's changed over time, but the irony of the early childhood comments juxtaposed against the adult outcomes, I think it was an interesting my research is me-search, and that's a popular expression that people study what they're personally fascinated by for whatever reason, and in my case that's absolutely true.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's really just, I just can't say enough. The book is just such a great read, and the personal stories included really make for a powerful connection for all of us. Why don't we start just with, there are people asking about different definitions of grit. They've heard it at different papers, and in the book, and maybe just ask you and to just say from your perspective, what is grit, if you just define it for us?
Grit is what I define as a combination of two elements. One is perseverance for long-term goals, and the other is passion for long-term goals. So not just working hard and being resilient, staying on track, that's perseverance, but also, having something that you love, that you find endlessly interesting, and that you feel is meaningful, that has purpose for you. So not just the kind of image that many of us have when you say the word grit. It's not just kind of mental toughness and being diligent. Maybe that's the obvious half of grit, but also being diligent and being hardworking and being resilient about something you deeply care about. At the extreme, when you look at extraordinarily gritty people, they would feel that this thing that they're working for, what is sometimes called a telos, an ultimate end, an ultimate concern, is, even part of who they are.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you find there is some, you've talked about at times the measure, the inclusion of passion. Could you talk more about just how important that is in the overall measurement of grit and the expression of it?
Yeah, well, I want to tell you how I got to identify what these elements were and how that came to create the grit scale. I was interviewing high achievers and as many different fields as I could find high achievers who would speak to me. And I found that there was a theme, two themes really, this perseverance and then also this passion. But importantly, as I interviewed these high achievers and had them talk not only about themselves, but about the people that they most admired, which was actually the most useful way to have the conversation. Tell me about the person you most admire in law, in art, in music, in whatever your field is. And they had no problem telling me who that person was and what they were like. The interesting nuance there that was surprising to me to some extent was not just the intensity with which these people worked, but the consistency. And really grit is about consistency over long stretches of time. So not just being really hardworking and staying up all night, 2 nights in a row, that's really intensity, but more that you are consistently hardworking person, you are consistently resilient in the face of setbacks, so that over the marathon of doing something, you're really there with your perseverance. And the same really with passion. So not just that you're crazy interested in something for a short time, but that you stay interested in and committed to something over long periods of time. It's interesting that I found that because it was, roughly a century earlier that a study at Stanford University by a psychologist named Catherine Cox, which she undertook the study of 301 geniuses and asked the question, how are these geniuses different from non-geniuses? How are these truly eminent individuals different from, the rest of us? And she said, what's interesting about these geniuses is the consistency, and that's the word she used, the consistency of their effort and the consistency of their interest. And that really is the heart of grit.
Oh, that's awesome. The questions are going to start rolling in here. We have a whole bunch already, so I'll start queuing them up for you. And thank you for one of the things I'll just tell everyone. Angela has said, whatever question you have, bring it, share it. This is the forum to do it. And that's why she's here for the.
Yeah, ask me hard ones.
Yeah, and I love that. I talked to her offline and said, isn't that great how that and she said, no, I love that. That's where we learn and we grow and can clarify and right.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's awesome. So one of the first questions is just around passion, and if you could talk a little bit more about, and this comes from Diane Martin, and her question is, how can you do, or how do we define passion, and how can we best support individuals in discovering their passions?
I think that when you're really passionate about something, two things are true. One is it's something that interests you. Second is it's important to you. And interest and importance Well, you can think of a lot of things that are both, but you can think of some things that are only one but not the other. I find it interesting to read Us Weekly. I'm sorry to say, it's a little vice that I have, but
Right.
it's really interesting to me. It's not important to me, but it holds my attention, and every issue that comes, I'm like, drawn to it like a bee to honey. So there are many things that we find interesting but not important. There are some things that we might find important but not interesting. When I make my daughters who are 13 and 14, if I make them their lunch for the day, I think it's important for me to do. It's not particularly interesting to me. But when you talk about passion, it is typically something that is both interesting and important. And so then that gives you a bit of a clue as to how to cultivate passion. Well, how do we develop interest? What do we know about that? One thing to say about that is that interests really are developed over time with experience and exposure. You cannot just sit in your bedroom and wonder about whether you'll be interested in rowing or interested in, playing a musical instrument or becoming a writer. You have to actually do it. And over time, with experience and exposure and support, there's the possibility that that interest will grow. So one thing that I like to say about interest is that rather than talking too much about discovering your interest, which makes it sound like a scavenger hunt, like you just have to find it under a rock and then you're done, it's really something that you have to proactively, with energy and with support, develop over time. And actually, if you look at some people who grow up to be interested in something, it's not that they had a sudden light bulb moment and they knew all at once. Sometimes it happens that way, but oftentimes it's like they were doing something for a few years and they're getting gradually more and more captivated by that topic. I said that the other thing that you want to have is something that is important to you. A word that I like to use for this, it comes from researchers like Bill Damon at Stanford, who talk about purpose. When you ask what does it mean to be important to you, almost always it comes down to that the work that you're doing helps other people. And that's why Us Weekly on a Friday night is not important, because it doesn't help anybody else. It just, gives me something to do on a Friday night when I'm tired. However, my work, being a psychologist, working on character development in kids, that is something when I wake up in the morning, I think if I do my job well, other people will benefit. And so when you talk about developing a passion, it's great to try to think about something that will capture your attention over time, but it's equally important to find something that for you will be meaningful in the sense that it will help you serve other people in the way that resonates with you. Just to give another personal example, when I was in college, I wanted to help the world, as I think really almost everybody in this planet feels a kind of compulsion to try to do something. I volunteered for a year in a homeless shelter, and it was important, but it didn't really resonate with me for whatever reason. It was like, this is good and important work. I respect these people a lot, but for me, I gravitated towards education and helping children. So I think when we look for interest and we look for purpose in our lives so that we can have more passion, it's important to realize that it is a process of discovery, and some things which kind of objectively ought to be interesting to you and ought to feel, be filled with purpose, aren't for whatever reason. And that's the, trial and error messiness of kind of cultivating a passion over time, figuring out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's, there's a portion in the book, I being a parent like you there in the book that really spoke to me, and that is, it's great if we know what our passion is, but you had said that even people who are super successful and are gritty in their pursuit of their expertise, that it starts with play, it starts with fun, it starts with trying things out, and that even the most, to quote you in the book, in other words, even the most accomplished of experts start out as unserious beginners. So there's hope for all of us.
There's hope for all of us, and I think there's a really important message, as you point out, for parents, because, when you talk about grit and practicing and being diligent and being resilient, you might miss a very important opening chapter in all of this, which is that when people start off down a path that will eventually become a lifelong passion, the early steps are typical, very playful, unserious ones. So, for example, if you look at Mark Vetri, he's a Italian chef here in Philadelphia, voted whatever. He's got all the awards, right? Best chef in the country, James Beard Awards. But if you look at how he got started, he was just watching his grandmother make Sunday dinner in South Philly. And then, he started washing dishes to make some money, and he starts watching these guys cook in restaurants, and, he starts cooking, and he starts making his own lasagna. But it wasn't like his parents made him practice cooking for 6 hours a day. And so, I think that if you don't allow children to explore in a reasonably unserious, non-committal, playful way things that could eventually become lifelong passions, you are, I think, imposing upon them maybe your own passions. And I have not yet interviewed a real paragon of grit, a real exemplar of this thing that I study, who tells me, really, this interest comes from without versus within. Passion is intrinsic, not extrinsic.
That's awesome. So some more questions. One is around, have you seen, this is from Kate Atkin from Cambridge in the UK, and she said, have you seen a gender difference in those taking the grit scale? Are men grittier than women or vice versa?
It's a great question. I've looked in my data. I occasionally find that there is a gender difference, and it favors women, where in some samples I found that women score higher in grit than men. The difference is very small, and also in other samples I don't find that. I think there's recently been a meta-analysis that looked systematically across lots of people's data sets and found that there might be a very, very small difference, but I don't even know if it reaches statistical significance. So there may be, but if there is one, it's very, very slight. In other words, men and women are more like each other than they are different from each other, at least in grit.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. A number of questions have come in, so I'll sort of combine them. And that is to hear your thoughts on the links or overlap between grit, self-regulation, resilience, conscientiousness, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, let me take conscientiousness first. So for those of you who know about the Big Five theory of personality, you know that conscientiousness is one of 5 major families of personality traits. This is kind of like the north, south, east, and west of personality, except for there are 5, not 4. The other 4 dimensions, or they're sometimes called Big Five factors, would be agreeableness, neuroticism, sometimes it's called emotional stability, the opposite, openness to experience, and extroversion. And from the very earliest days of doing grit research, I of course wanted to know, where does grit fit in this taxonomy, in this kind of Big Five framework? And it fits where you think it might, which is grit correlates pretty highly actually with measures of Big Five conscientiousness. That doesn't mean it's the exact same thing as conscientiousness, because conscientiousness also includes things like being an orderly and neat person, being a punctual person, being somebody who's good at impulse control, right? Regulating your emotions and so forth. And so I do believe that grit is related to Big Five conscientiousness, but I think of it as a facet of Big Five conscientiousness. And the other thing, just to say there, and this may be more nuanced than people really want, the part about grit, which is perseverance, being diligent, a hard worker, that's probably the most related to conscientiousness. Having a consistent passion over time, that's less related to these other things in the conscientiousness family, but also a big part of grit. So that's one answer. Resilience, I think, is a really important precedent or input to grit. So I think that you could be a resilient person who isn't necessarily gritty because you're lacking some other things. Like, you're resilient, you bounce back, but you don't have a passion, right? You don't have something that guides what you do, that you wake up every day and you're like, I love this is great, I'm going to work on it. So I think resilience is an important part of perseverance, and perseverance is part of being gritty, but I don't think it's exactly the same thing. So these are overlapping but not identical. I think that helps. I don't know if you want me to go into like every other, there's hope, there's a lot of words in psychology, and one of the challenges, I think, of being a psychologist or a consumer of psychology is that there are a lot of words that overlap and people use them differently. And that can be very confusing. But at least for those, 2 things, conscientiousness and resilience, I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and we appreciate that. There's no doubt about it. There, as you said, just as you said, I could talk about every other term, but and a whole bunch came in. So we'll continue with some of the other questions because these are all real good ones. One of them is around the grit scale itself. If you could just talk a little bit about the grit scale, what it's measuring, and you've talked about the potential for revising it a bit, and
Mm-hmm.
talk to us about that and where you think the scale might go.
Yeah, like any other questionnaire or really any other thing, it could be better. I developed the grit scale in gosh, it must have been my first or second year of graduate school. So, so what it is just a series of statements, like most questionnaires, and you read these sentences like, I am a hard worker, I finish whatever I begin. My interests change from year to year, and you reflect for a moment, and you check off, very much like me, not much like me, wherever you are in the middle, and from those statements, I calculate a grit score, and the more you say that you are a persevering, diligent, resilient kind of person, that's the perseverance subscale, or a person whose interests are consistent from year to year as opposed to changing, new directions all the time. That's your passion subscore. That's your grit score, and that's what I've used at places like West Point or the National Spelling Bee or studying salespeople or kids in the Chicago public schools to see whether I can predict achievement outcomes and to see whether these things are exactly the same as conscientiousness or measures of talent, etc. So that's what the grit scale is. It was designed for research. I think it can also be used as a kind of a tool for self-reflection. When you answer these questions, it gets you thinking about, how consistent you have been. Not to say that you have to punish yourself afterwards for not having a good enough score. It's just interesting. It's a moment to ask yourself with some specificity about your own grit. Research and reflection are one thing. I don't think that this scale is appropriate for high stakes assessment for lots of reasons. So I just want to bound kind of what I think the scale is good for, and importantly say, there are things that you wouldn't want to use it for. In terms of improving the scale, you're absolutely right that I think it can be improved. In particular, I think those questions about your passion, which ask you about how consistent your interests are from year to year, I don't think they are as phrased as well as they could be. I mean, I did it as good a job as I could in 2003 or something, but I was recently talking to Larry King, actually, he's interviewing me, and we actually took the grit scale together online, and he said, interests change from year to year. Mine change every day. I interview somebody else every day. And I said, well, that's interesting, Larry, but let me try to explain what I really meant by those questions. You've been a journalist in front of the television camera for really your whole life, and when you retired, you made a decision to actually come out of retirement, right? And what did you decide to do? You decided to have another talk show and interview
Right.
people. So the real heart of those questions, and it could be better articulated, I'd like to work on that, planning on working on that with Scott Kaufman, a colleague of mine here at Penn. Can we phrase those questions to get at whether people's kind of interests have a through line, have a theme? I mean, is there a coherence to what you're doing so that when you look at your mornings and your afternoons, and for some of us our evenings, that what we're doing is oriented to a kind of a goal that would give meaning and purpose to all the other goals. So that's what it's really about, but I could have done a better job of articulating it.
It's a very full answer and a good one for the question. Here's some follow-up, just to give a flavor of some of the questions that were coming in. Where Jody Fissler from State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, she was asking about that how for job candidate evaluation or college admissions, is there concern in that area? And I'm hearing just from you that being for high stakes uses, that's a concern.
Yeah, I would not use the grit scale for, college admissions because, I mean, it's not rocket science like how to get a 5 out of 5 on the grit scale. When I use it in research and the data just gets sucked into a database and doesn't really influence your life, there's less of an incentive to fake a higher score. And there are other problems with questionnaires. Limitations is one way to put it. But for example, if I give you the grit scale and you have really high standards for yourself, right? Maybe you're being totally honest, but you're just, you're hard on yourself. You're going to give yourself a lower score than somebody else who has slacker standards. And that's another concern I have when it really comes down to a high stakes decision about this person's life. I do, though, sympathize with and support the enthusiasm that decision makers have for really looking for qualities like grit, not just grit, but of course other things that we all care about, emotional intelligence and being a kind person, etc. The challenge is, how do you measure them? For grit, I would say that you want to look for evidence that this person has been passionate or persevering about something. For many kids, that will look like a record of continuous involvement in a certain extracurricular, like a team sport, or playing music, or working on the newspaper. For kids from less advantaged backgrounds, I think we have to look even harder for that evidence, because it may not be that kid was on the crew team for 3 years. It may be that kid was working a job after school, for 3 years and got, promoted and more responsibility. Or maybe they were taking care of their, little brother at home because there was nobody else to do that. If you can find evidence that person has worked hard on something, has been resilient, has demonstrated a constancy of purpose, of an emerging passion, I think if you look for that in the way they've spent their time, that to me is not a fakeable questionnaire. It's itself, it presents its own engineering challenges, but that's the direction in which I would go.
Oh, that's great. Sarah Perry Johnson, actually, you just answered her question, and that was just working with students who have been marginalized due to race or gender or sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, immigration status. You just gave some real good thinking for her to explore, and as you said, looking for evidence and maybe harder to find places than what are obvious in some other cases.
Yeah, and I would like to maybe pick up on that and just say that, I think often, people say that if you're interested in character, or you're interested in, grit in particular, then there's a real danger of kind of blaming the victim, or, kind of looking, ignoring people's circumstances. And I hope that we wouldn't do that, right? I think about the fact that, in the time in my life that kind of led me to become a psychologist, but preceded me being a psychologist. This is working in public schools. Many of my kids, not at all from backgrounds of, advantage or privilege. We wouldn't want to say like, wow, you're not passionate and you're not persevering, like it's your fault. And now, like it's, now we don't have to do anything for you. It's exactly the opposite. I think for those kids, we need to look harder for the evidence they've already cultivated these qualities. Maybe it's not as obvious because their records don't have the kind of easy hallmarks of an upper middle class kid to say like, oh, there's their grit. And B, it is always the responsibility of the adults, the community, to give kids the chance to develop these character strengths. I don't think blame is ever helpful, and particularly when it comes to children and their future.
Yeah, that's great. Well, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Angela Duckworth, author of the best-selling book, Grit, Passion and Perseverance. Another question has come in, and this is one of the critiques, and this is around, it's put forward in this way. Vince Punzo, professor of psychology at Earlham College in Richmond, had said that, wondering if you've had a chance to read the article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that was just published with a meta-analysis of the grit literature, and it's titled Much Ado About Grit, in which the authors conclude that the quote-unquote, the construct validity of grit is in question. So have you had a chance to read that, Angela? And of course you have.
Yeah, I think it's by Marcus Crede. I don't know how to pronounce. I know how to spell his last name. Yeah, I did. I mean, I think the article is still in press, so I don't think the supplemental materials are available. But of course, I read it with interest, and he also put out a very sharply worded press release that I felt wasn't terrifically fair to the work. But here's what I think. I don't actually. So for readers who haven't read this article, it's a meta-analysis. In other words, an analysis of both published and unpublished studies that have used the grit scale to ask the question, what does grit really predict? And that project in itself, like, take all the research that's been done and put it all together. I think it's actually a very useful thing to do. Meta-analysis is a great way to kind of figure out what we really know. In this particular meta-analysis, the major outcome of interest is grade point average, and so these are all student samples. Most of the samples, it says in the paper, are cross-sectional. In other words, you measure grit and you measure grades at the same time. And I believe that many, but I don't know what fraction, maybe most, are self-reported grades, not grades from school records. So these aren't longitudinal studies, and they're not studies that use official records of grades, but those are really trivial details. Let's assume that, the same results would hold if they were studies of kids who were followed over time and you actually got the transcripts. The major findings, if you look at the tables, are that the grit scale, and in particular they kind of look at passion and perseverance subscales separately, they are correlated with grades, not as correlated with report card grades as Big Five conscientiousness. And when you include both Big Five conscientiousness and passion and perseverance as separate indicators in a model, and you ask, in this kind of horse race, like, well, what predicts best? I believe that conscientiousness may predict best, and passion ends up not being predictive in this kind of, simultaneous model. Perseverance does. So what do we make of that? Well, a couple of years ago, I published a paper that said that grit is not the only indicator of or measure of or predictor of success. It matters particularly to challenging, personally meaningful accomplishment. It's not the only thing that matters, and for other kinds of achievement, like sticking to our diets, or I think I said explicitly your grades, maybe other things that I also, by the way, study. I study Big Five conscientiousness. I've written papers on it, and I study self-control, another facet of Big Five conscientiousness. And in that paper, I said, in my own data, I can see that, for example, being a kid who's in control of their impulses is more related to your grades than your grit, because grades for many students is not that super challenging, personally very meaningful goal. It's just something that you ought to do because you sort of know that at some level it matters to your future. So I hope this isn't too much nuance, but I would say that I'm not at all surprised by the major findings of the meta-analysis. I myself 2 years ago predicted that grit would not be the be-all end-all for every sort of achievement outcome. I think the finding itself is useful, but I would like to just say that I see a kind of I don't know how to say it. It's like a meanness, like a sort of like gotcha. Oh look, you did something that I'm going to say is wrong. I personally feel as a scientist that we can have open and honest debate, and we can disagree, and you can publish papers that say, I don't think this is true, without descending into a kind of mean-spirited, petty tone that I did not love about the paper, and in particular about the press release that the same professor decided to release. So I'm hoping to live my talk, like I'm hoping to myself be a civil and humane human being, but the major findings themselves, conscientiousness, super related, and for an outcome like grades, maybe, at least as relevant, if not more, than this one facet, grit. I don't have any quibble with that. I believe those findings.
Yeah, that's very helpful. There's a whole number of questions that came in related to that. There's only one specific one that was brought up a couple times, and that is the study at West Point of the cadets and how they were able to get through that summer, the complete summer training. And any comments, Angela, just on how it was shown that grittier cadets were more likely to stay with it and stick with it. And there was some question about how it was presented as to, was it overstated in any way? How would you?
Oh, right, odds ratios. Okay, so I will try to be clear on this because I know we've got a broad audience of listeners here, but there is a statistical model called a binary logistic regression, which I used in that first paper and in one other paper, and I've actually used then in further papers. When do you use this model? You use it when the outcome is a kind of yes-no outcome. Did they stay or did they leave? In this binary logistic regression model, the statistic that is of interest is an odds ratio, which I reported correctly in the tables and in the, all the numbers are right. There was one sentence, though, that I misphrased. I said that the likelihood, essentially, of staying at West Point, if you're one standard deviation higher in grit, if you're higher in grit than your other cadets, that the likelihood was, X% higher. What I should have said is that the odds are X%. And there's a difference between likelihood and odds in statistical terms. I don't think in the terms that people use on the street, like, if you ask somebody like on the streets of Manhattan, like, what's the difference between odds and likelihood? I'm not sure people would be able to tell you. But that was a mistake. It was an error. It was not an intentional error to mislead. I've never seen a popular press article that, zeroed in on this one sentence about the binary logistic regression model. But it was an error, and I fully own that. Because I have never deleted any of my email, I actually searched my own email for the time period, going back now a decade to when I was actually consulting with a statistician about the binary logistic regression model, because I was just a graduate student when I know, and I actually found the email where he said explicitly, like, I cut and pasted a paragraph where I explained the binary, how to, this is how I'm going to express these binary logistic regression results, and his email back is, this is exactly right. Now, I had a choice when I found this email. I could then, sue or publicly shame a statistician who gave me advice that ended up not being maybe the best advice about that phrasing. But I said to this statistician, I emailed him back, actually. I was like, hey, I found this email from 10 years ago, and I think I could have phrased this differently. I should have said the odds instead of the likelihood. I feel badly about this, but I just wanted to clarify, here's the email itself from 10 years ago, like, did I misinterpret you? And he wrote back and he's like, no, you didn't misinterpret me. It probably is better to say it. He's like, but you know what? Like, who would quibble over this, like, tiny nuance? Your tables are right. The numbers are right. It's a binary model. Like, everybody knows how, like, what it really means. And I guess I'll just raise that to say that I think it's very important for me to say, look, I did make an error. And in subsequent papers, when I've presented by, like, if you look at papers that I've written 5 years later, like I say odds instead of likelihood, so that's better, like I've improved. But I wouldn't say that error was, a gross misrepresentation. The numbers are completely correct. Certainly wasn't with the intent to deceive. And I would just say this about, I guess, science. We're always wrong. I mean, I am not here to tell people that I know everything and that you should just listen to me. I am telling you what I think to be true, but it wouldn't be science if it weren't something that, you do the next paper and, you're like, oh, well, actually, we find that, the effect is a little bit closer to this, or, this time I'm going to run the statistics this way because there's been an advance in statistics, and, like, it's really better to give the confidence intervals and not the p-values. So, I want to say that I did make an incorrect, there's a sentence or two in that original paper that is incorrectly phrased, but I don't want to make a mountain out of that molehill, and I certainly don't want to, assume that anybody else that was, part of that paper is, wrong, including the statistician. I mean, not wrong, but, like, I don't want to attribute malintent to anybody involved, including the statistician who helped me with the models themselves.
Yeah, you just gave an example of, when you come up with compelling research, compelling findings, there questions come up, and that's what we had talked about off air, is that, these questions come in, and just your forthrightness, this is the notes coming in right now, are just people just appreciate your candor, your openness, your willingness to debate, your willingness to take challenges, that are put forward and questions, and it's just a real model for everyone, to not shy away from the conflict, but to address it and then move on to the very important work that's being done. So thank you, Angela, for that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to memorize. I don't know if anybody on this webinar knows the Rudyard Kipling poem, If you can keep when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. Those are the first two lines of that poem. And I'm really trying to make allowance for doubting too. I think it doesn't serve anybody well if all you do is defend yourself. Like, I'm right. Grit's great. Everyone else is wrong. I've never made an error. I'm really trying not to do that. But at the same time, I'm trying to, stay focused, like you said, on the work and not spend all of my time trying to correct every misconception, because then I wouldn't be doing research anymore. I would just be doing public relations.
Yes, right, exactly. There are a ton of questions, so let's see how we might summarize the question and maybe the response. A question about increasing grit, and in adults, in the classroom, for students. Your thoughts on the interventions that are coming out, and your thoughts on just the flexibility of us to build our grit.
Yeah, I'll start with saying that I completely agree with Carol Dweck about human nature, and that is that Carol believes that people are designed to grow and to adapt and to change. There is very little about us that is entirely fixed, at least when it comes to psychology. I'm not going to get any taller, but, can I become more optimistic? Can I become more resilient? Could I deepen my interests? Could I learn to be things that I don't study personally but are important, like grateful, kind, more generous, more honest, more imaginative? I think the answer to all of these questions is yes. And I don't think either Carol or I are trying to sell people the idea that, like, anybody could be Einstein, or anybody could be, Martha Graham, that anybody could be the great person who, seems to be so different from us. But we are saying that human nature is malleable, and it is, the brain grows and changes all throughout life. So I think that the question is then, how would you intentionally try to, move in the direction that you want to? I guess I'll say the theory that underlies everything that I've done, and I try to articulate in some detail in the book, is that if you can really understand something, if you really understand optimism, you stand a better chance to become more optimistic. If you really can break grit down into passion and perseverance, and then break passion down into interest and purpose, and then you try to say, like, well, what is purpose? And what do we know about people who develop it? And when do they develop it? And why do they develop it? And when do we lose it? That kind of metacognitive awareness, that kind of understanding yourself, to me, is the very first step to trying to intentionally cultivate these things. I guess I'm putting a bet on the fact that understanding can really accelerate growth. It may not be the only thing that you need. You certainly need other people to be supportive. I don't think it's very easy to develop grit when there aren't people around you who are both supportive of your journey and also challenging in the right ways, like asking you to do things that you're not yet comfortable doing, maybe a little scared. So it's not all up to you, and it's not just understanding yourself. But I think it is a very important first step. And I'll just name one other psychologist who, Carol's a role model for me. I mean, I often try on my worst days to say, like, what would Carol do? The other person I think of a lot is Walter Mischel, who, of course, brought us the great work on self-control and delay of gratification. And I think one of the major insights of his life work is that if you can understand what happens when someone successfully exerts self-control, and then, of course, when we fail to, like, that is a major step forward to trying to be more self-controlled ourselves. So, yeah, I believe that self-awareness, know thyself, is the first step to cultivating anything that you would like, including grit.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's a question from Jesus. Let me make sure I have it right here. And it is, hold on, because he's got a good one. Jesus Alfonso Datu, great name, says, does grit operate differently in non-Western cultures?
Fascinating question. I don't know. I mean, that would be a very short answer, but I'll just say one other thing is that, I do think there are important cultural differences when you move from, country to country, and even within the same country, you can have different cultures. You go visit different families and different schools, and you're like, oh, it's different here. That's culture too. I think that often I get these I get these visits from dignitaries from, Asian countries like China, and I'm myself ethnically Chinese, and oftentimes these dignitaries will say, "I think we've got perseverance figured out. Can you tell me more about passion?" So I do think there are interesting differences. They're very hard to study, by the way, because when you translate a scale into another language and you hand it to someone, what they bring to that scale is like all their own cultural assumptions and norms, and so you can't really do apples to apples comparisons in an easy way. But I'm endlessly fascinated by cultural differences. I think they really shine a light on what it is that we really mean, by passion and by perseverance, for example.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. There's a whole bunch of questions relating to research going forward. Katie Snyder phrased it this way: what's next in grit research, including your hopes and dreams for how it might be applied?
Terrific question. I'll tell you something that's on the immediate horizon. Anders Ericsson, whose work I summarize, I hope I do it justice in the chapter on practice. I do that because we have found that gritty people not only show up to things like finishing BSPERICS or completing their degrees, completing their master's, completing their law degree, but they also continuously try to improve themselves. They're continuously challenging themselves. I'll give you one example, and then I'll tell you what I hope to do with Anders starting this August. So Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was just beautiful poetic words I felt compelled to put into the last chapter of the book. He's a MacArthur Fellow. He is a writer and a journalist who wrote Between the World and Me, and he has maybe more eloquently than anybody else expressed what it means to be a writer. Anyway, I was talking to him after the book came out and saying, gosh, this is hard to be the object of criticism. This person, Ta-Nehisi, I'll tell you what kind of person he is. He called me. I mean, he is so busy, and we aren't really like best friends. He just, we're kind of, fellow travelers on, fellow writers. He called me at home and he said, you doing all right? And I was like, it's hard for people to tell me like I'm a racist or like I don't care about poverty when that's like not true. And he said, look, focus on your work. Then we're having this conversation about his own writing, about grit, about hard work. He's like, I wrote Between the World and Me 5 times. And, the whole thing, I mean, there's so much revision. There's so much continuous improvement. This kind of practice that Anders Ericsson studies of high achievers, constantly trying to get better, constantly challenging yourself to do things just a little bit differently, a little better than the day before. That's what Ta-Nehisi Coates embodies, and that's actually what I have been studying as one of the things that grit leads to, doing more of this kind of effortful, challenging practice. What's on the horizon for me, or one of the things, is to understand whether that kind of practice could be something that is flow-like. What Anders typically finds is what I typically find, which is that people will talk about this practice as being maybe satisfying, but like really tiring and not fun. But rarely I do find the individual who says that it can be almost like flow. And I want to know more about that. If this kind of, writing, rewriting, getting better, a little bit, if it can be more like flow and less like work or less like burden, then I think we'll really get somewhere, because then we'll actually be able to do much more of what it is that makes us better.
Yeah, that's awesome. A couple questions just sort of on the other side, questions around, is there any dark side to grit or any concerns specifically that you would caution people in terms of their pursuance of grit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the possibilities, and there was actually a study done, I can't remember the researchers, but it was published in Journal of Research in Personality, where, they measured grit at the beginning of the experiment, and they essentially asked people to do a series of anagrams, right? You have to unscramble the letters and make up, tell what the word it really is in English. And when you give people a mix of both very, very difficult anagrams and also impossible anagrams, in other words, there is no word that you can unscramble these letters and you give them a whole series of them, and you allow them to kind of pace themselves and sort of skip the ones they want. What you find is that grittier people tend to try longer on the impossible ones than less gritty people, and that could be a cost of grit, like doing things that are impossible, right? Like, sort of not knowing when to quit, really. So I think that's a very likely, I guess, dark side or threat, or, it's a risk of when you're really gritty, you could be like I'm trying to help kids develop character. I'm trying to bring scientists and educators together. Well, what if that's impossible, right? What if that's just a fool's errand? Well, that's a risk that I'm taking. I guess in answer to that, I would point out that in the very same study, when you actually look at the scores of these people, like, how did they do overall, taking all the anagrams that they did correctly, they actually don't score more poorly. It's just that on those impossible ones, they tried maybe quote unquote too long, but it didn't compromise their overall performance. And I would say that I'm more worried about people quitting too early and giving up too easily and counting themselves out too soon than I am about going too far, though I acknowledge it is theoretically certainly a possibility. What might protect us from throwing good money after bad or going on these fool's errands that never lead anywhere is to always remember that there is a why behind every how. So if we continuously ask ourselves, why am I working on this project? If it's true that we aren't making progress and we're not making progress, and we stop to ask why, that why will lead us to a kind of, well, the reason I'm doing this is because it serves this higher thing. Like, why do I want to become a veterinarian? I keep trying to go into vet school, but I keep getting rejected. Well, why do I want to be a veterinarian? Well, because I love animals. Well, maybe that why question and its answer, because I love animals, will lead us to some flexibility on our goals. It's like, well, being a veterinarian is not the only way to help animals. There are other ways. Work for a zoo, work for the Humane Society. So I just want to say that there may be limitations or downsides to grit. I don't worry about them too much because I see the huge costs of not having a consistency in your direction, learning how to work hard and be resilient. But there are real ones, and I think what might help us in those situations is to remind ourselves that there really is a why behind the things that we do, and that why is maybe the most important thing and not the kind of means to the end that we might be working on a day-to-day basis.
No, that's great. That's inspiring for all of us to really think about that and really launch our activities based on that powerful why. One of the things you said too, Angela, that I just want to point people to in the book that I thought was just great. You said something to this effect. Let's say it's page 273 in the United States version, and you say, "I've been asked on more than one occasion why I feel grit is the only thing that matters. In fact, I don't." And this is what you were just talking about before, that grit is important, but there are other character strengths that to you are just as important. And so grit, as you say here, grit isn't everything. There are many other things a person needs in order to grow and flourish. Character is plural. Do you want to talk a little bit about the character lab that you are heading up?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, I hope that people don't think that because I study grit and self-control, that means that I only care about that. I mean, it's not the most fair accusation. I mean, if you talk to somebody who, studies climate change, you could be like, why aren't you working on poverty? Don't you care about poverty? It's like, that person probably does care about poverty, but, you only do so much. So I thought it was important for me to mention that in the book. And yes, I, 3 years ago, founded a nonprofit to advance the science and practice of character development, and I do believe that character is plural. This is what Aristotle said. This is what Ben Franklin said. This is what every great thinker on character has said. It's not just being hardworking. It's also not just being honest. It's not just being grateful. It's not just being curious. It's all of those things and more. And I'll say that I think that there are really 3 dimensions of character that I can identify in the data I collect on children. One of the things is the kind of thing that I work on, grit, self-control, things that enable you to reach your own personal goals, whatever those goals are. The second aspect of character is so important because, of course, we want those goals to not only benefit ourselves, but other people. The second kind of dimension of character is really about other people. Sometimes it's called moral character or interpersonal character. And these are things like gratitude, kindness, generosity, really being an empathic and emotionally sensitive person. I don't work on those personally, but in the book I say if I had to choose and God only let me have one of those things for my own daughters, of course I would choose the second group over the first one because that is more important. I just don't think they're exclusive. I hope as a parent I can encourage both. The third major dimension is intellectual character or intellectual strengths like curiosity, imagination, genuinely being open-minded to new ideas, zest for learning. I really think that as a parent myself and as a scientist and as a former educator, that all three of these dimensions are worthy and that we can encourage all of them. I wrote a book about grit because that's what I study, but I'm a human being and I absolutely believe that these other aspects of character are at least, if not more important.
No, that's awesome, and I just have to say, and I think I speak for so many people as we wrap up here, that your work inspires us to make really the most of the life that we have. We don't take it lightly, especially the older we get, to realize, how we realize how life is fleeting, and so we want to take full advantage of our opportunities. And there's a line in the movie As Good as It Gets, where Jack Nicholson says, "You make me want to be a better man." I think that's, Angela, with your work with character, with your work with grit. You make us want to be better people, and I thank you for
Thank you.
everything you're doing.
Thank you, David. And you know what? This conversation is going to make me a better psychologist, so I really appreciate it so much.
Well, you're very welcome, and you, again, you're just the best. You said bring on all questions, and we did, and it's just for all of us just to be able to share what we do and engage with everyone, and you did that just masterfully today. So we want to just thank a few people as we close here. First of all, let me just make sure to say very clearly that this is a must-read book. It's available pretty much everywhere books are sold. It's called, again, Grit, the Power of Passion and Perseverance. Grit, the Power of Passion and Perseverance. Angela Duckworth, just a phenomenal book. So make sure you get it on your bookshelf. I want to thank, as we close, Executive Director James Pawelski for all his work in making this series possible and all the good work of our association possible. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson for being our president and all the work that she puts into putting forward the best foot of positive psychology and helping develop it further. Our producer of the series, the birthday girl, as we spoke about earlier, Jenny Brennan, who does all the work behind the scenes to help bring this to all of you as our members. And our technical and social media director, Sydney Rubin. We thank her for her good work. So thank you again for joining us. I'm David J. Paulé, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for making a difference through your work in positive psychology. And good luck enhancing your grit. Go for it. Goodbye.